I never thought a single favor could erase 10 years of love. For a decade I opened my door before sunrise, holding bottles, breakfast bowls, and small hands that trusted me more than anyone. I never asked for payment, never kept score. I just believed that family didn't owe each other. Love was the currency, and I was rich. But the morning I told my daughter-in-law I couldn't babysit because I had a hospital appointment, she looked at me as if I had broken a sacred rule. She didn't shout, she didn't argue. She just said, flat and cold, "Then we'll find someone who actually wants to be a grandmother." That sentence didn't echo, it burned. It turned every smile, every lunchbox, every bedtime story into a question mark. What was I to them? A grandmother, or a free service that never called in sick? I stood there with my purse still on my shoulder and my doctor's note trembling in my hand. 10 years of good mornings, 10 years of watch them don't worry, 10 years of yes when I meant I'm tired. All of it vanished in one line. People talk about betrayal like it comes with thunder and slamming doors. But sometimes it walks in quietly, wearing polite perfume, typing on its phone while it decides you're no longer useful. That day, betrayal smelled like lavender shampoo and sounded like an iPhone keyboard. My son didn't defend me. He just adjusted his tie and said, "Mom, you have to understand, we need consistency for the kids." Consistency. As if my pulse, my pain, my surgery were inconveniences on a family calendar. I left their house without closing the door all the way. Maybe I wanted the wind to finish the goodbye I couldn't speak. The car ride home was a blur of red lights and swallowed tears. At every intersection I thought, 10 years. 10 years since I stopped celebrating my own birthday because it fell on a school recital weekend. 10 years since I postponed my reading group, my doctor appointments, my quiet mornings. 10 years since I was anything but, "Grandma, can you?" But here's the hidden truth no one likes to admit. When you give endlessly, people stop seeing it as kindness. They start seeing it as obligation. And when you finally say, "Not today," they act like you've broken a promise you never made. That realization hit me harder than the words themselves. I wasn't just heartbroken, I was invisible. When I reached home, the house felt smaller, like it too was waiting for permission to rest. I put the kettle on and stared at the steam until it faded, wondering if love could evaporate just as quietly. On the counter sat a photo of my grandkids at the park, smiling, free, blissfully unaware of the storm between adults. My chest ached. Not from anger, but from the sharp weight of truth. I had raised generations and forgotten to raise myself. I tried to convince myself it was just a bad day. That they'd call. That they'd realize how cruel that sentence sounded. But hours turned to days and my phone stayed silent. Every tick of the clock whispered the same thing. You were useful, not irreplaceable. That night, I sat by the window with my old diary, the one I hadn't opened since my husband passed. The first line on the first page read, "Never stop being needed." I stared at it for a long time before crossing it out. Maybe that was my mistake all along, believing that being needed was the same as being loved. Outside, the streetlight flickered, painting my reflection in pieces on the glass. I looked older than I remembered, not just in years but in exhaustion. Yet somewhere under that tired reflection was a spark, faint but stubborn. Maybe the kind of spark that could light a new beginning. I didn't know it yet, but that moment, the moment I finally sat in silence and didn't reach for the phone, was the first time in a decade I chose myself. And as the clock struck midnight, I whispered the words I'd never dared to say out loud. If being real means being alone, then maybe alone is where I start being real. I used to believe that love was measured by how much of yourself you could give away. When my son and his wife first asked me to help after their daughter was born, I said yes before they even finished the sentence. It wasn't about duty. It was joy. I held that baby through colic and fevers, whispered lullabies into the dark, and thought every sleepless night was proof of love. I never imagined those small sacrifices would one day become my identity, until I realized I'd built my entire life around their needs instead of my own. At first, it was easy to justify. I was newly retired, my husband had passed, and the silence of an empty house can be deafening. Caring for my grandkids gave me purpose. My mornings had meaning again. Packing lunches, ironing tiny uniforms, driving to piano lessons. But one task led to another, and slowly, my time became theirs. Vacations were postponed. Friend lunches cancelled. Even my book club faded away. I told myself it was temporary, just until they got back on their feet. Somehow, a few months turned into a decade. The house I'd once filled with music and laughter now smelled like forgotten tea and tired routines. The living room was stacked with toys that weren't mine, the fridge filled with snacks I didn't eat. I'd spend hours organizing their schedules, washing uniforms, and fixing school projects at midnight, all without complaint. And every time I thought about saying I needed a break, guilt silenced me. Because how could you say no to family? There were moments I thought they saw me, not as a helper, but as someone essential. Like the year I caught the flu and Trevor brought soup. I thought, finally, they care. But even then, the soup came with a reminder, please feel better soon, Mom, the kids have a recital. It was kindness with a deadline. I started realizing that the gratitude I longed for was replaced by routine expectation. Birthdays came and went with messages like, you know we love you, right? But love without action starts to sound like an echo, familiar, but empty. The last gift they gave me was a sweater, still with the price tag attached. Brooke said, we weren't sure what you'd like. 10 years of shared memories, and they didn't know my favorite color. Sometimes I'd glance at the mirror before leaving their house and barely recognize the woman staring back. The confident teacher who once organized school libraries, led reading clubs, and mentored children had become a shadow, waiting for her next assignment. I'd tell myself, this is what good mothers do. They give. But deep down, a quiet voice whispered, and what do you get back? Every year I thought about doing something for myself. Joining a painting class. Visiting the ocean. Even taking that church trip to the mountains. But there was always a reason not to go. Someone sick, someone busy, someone who needed me more. My body began to ache in small, persistent ways. Knees stiff in the morning, back sore from lifting, eyes tired from worry. Still, I smiled. Still, I said yes. Because somewhere along the way, I stopped believing I was allowed to say no. What I didn't realize was how deeply that habit of self-erasure had rooted itself. Each favor I said yes to was a quiet apology for wanting something of my own. Each sacrifice was a brick in the wall between who I was and who I'd become. And behind that wall, I'd buried more than just my hobbies or free time. I'd buried joy. Then one evening, I was cleaning up after dinner while the kids watched TV. Brooke walked in, still dressed for work, hair perfect, voice distant. She handed me a list for the next week. Pickup times, snacks, activities. I nodded automatically. But then she said, also, Mom, can you handle Friday? Trevor and I have a black tie fundraiser. I hesitated. I can't that day. I have a surgery scheduled for my knee. She barely looked up. Then we'll find someone else. It was such a simple sentence. Ordinary words arranged in a way that changed everything. Because in that instant, every memory of giving, helping, sacrificing condensed into a single painful truth. I had been everything for them, and they had been blind to it. That night, when I returned home, I didn't turn on the lights. I just sat in the dark, holding the list she gave me. 10 years of yes, undone by one no. And in that quiet, I began to understand. Sometimes love doesn't disappear. It just runs out of places to live. The morning of my surgery was cold, the kind of gray that makes the world look undecided. I'd packed my hospital papers neatly in a folder, laid out clothes for later, and even texted Trevor a reminder about the kids' pickup. Old habits die hard. But as I zipped my coat, I couldn't ignore the weight sitting on my chest. It wasn't fear of the operation. It was the ache of realizing no one had called to ask how I was feeling. Not my son. Not his wife. Not the family I had given everything to. I still remember standing in their kitchen a week earlier when I told them about the surgery. Brooke's reaction wasn't shock, it was annoyance. "You couldn't schedule it another day?" she'd asked, her voice sharp like the edge of glass. I'd smiled weakly, trying to explain that my knee had reached its limit, that the doctor had warned me not to delay again. She'd shrugged and muttered, "Well, I guess we'll find someone else then." And that was it. 10 years of devotion reduced to a scheduling inconvenience. But it wasn't until the night before the surgery that the final thread snapped. I'd sent a message to Trevor, just a simple one: "Please drop the kids by next week when I'm feeling better. I miss them." He read it but didn't reply. I stared at the seen checkmark until my eyes blurred. It wasn't just silence, it was dismissal. When I lay on the hospital bed that morning, a nurse asked if someone would be picking me up after the procedure. I almost said yes out of reflex, but then I caught myself. "No," I said softly, "just me." For the first time in 10 years, those two words were both terrifying and freeing. As they wheeled me down the sterile hallway, I kept thinking about every time I'd postponed my own health for someone else's convenience. The flu I'd ignored during soccer season. The back pain I'd dismissed because Brooke needed me to just cover a few more days. Every sacrifice had felt noble back then. Now it just felt foolish. When I woke up from the surgery, the nurse smiled kindly. "Everything went great. Do you have family waiting?" I looked around the empty recovery room and said, "No, but I'll be fine." And I meant it. Because somewhere between the anesthesia and the silence, something inside me had shifted. I wasn't angry anymore. I was done being useful without being seen. That evening, back at home, I sat by the window with my leg elevated and my phone buzzing quietly beside me. Missed calls. Messages from Trevor. "Hope it went okay, Mom." Short. Polite. Transactional. I didn't answer. Instead, I looked at the bandage wrapped around my knee and thought about how healing starts with cutting away what's damaged. Maybe the same rule applied to life. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. In that quiet, I realized that silence can either suffocate you or set you free, depending on what you do with it. I took a deep breath and opened the notebook I'd kept hidden in my drawer, the same one I used to track the kids' schedules. But this time, I turned to a blank page and wrote something new: what I owe myself. I listed small things at first: rest, peace, self-respect. Then bigger ones: boundaries, choice, freedom. I underlined the last one twice. Freedom. Not from them, but from the version of myself who believed love had to be earned through exhaustion. I didn't know what the next day would bring. Maybe they'd call, maybe they wouldn't. But for the first time in years, it didn't matter. My worth wasn't waiting on anyone's approval. It was already here, sitting quietly beside me in that small, warm room. As I closed my eyes that night, I felt something I hadn't in a very long time. Peace, thin and fragile like the first layer of dawn, but real. The morning after surgery, sunlight spilled weakly across my living room floor, brushing over the scattered photo frames that had collected dust through years of busy noise. I woke not to a child's cry or a phone alert, but to silence, a silence so full it felt alive. My leg throbbed with dull pain, but it was nothing compared to the emptiness that had been living inside me far longer than the ache in my knee. Still, for the first time in years, I didn't rush to fill that emptiness. I let it speak. I brewed tea slowly, listening to the sound of the kettle rise and fall. It was strange how something so ordinary could feel new when no one was waiting. I reached for my phone. 6 unread messages from Trevor. The last one read, "Hope your surgery went fine. We'll manage the kids this week. No, I miss you. No, are you okay?" Just management, as if love were a task to be scheduled. I set the phone down without replying. That was the moment I decided something quietly radical. I would stop chasing the kind of love that made me feel small. After breakfast, I reached for the yellow folder I'd used for hospital forms. Beneath it were old bills, receipts, and the notes I'd kept to track family expenses. Payments I'd covered, temporarily. Subscriptions still tied to my account. Grocery deliveries that went to their address but charged mine. I began to flip through them one by one. Each paper felt heavier than the last. Not because of the money, but because of the years I'd signed my name under the illusion that generosity would guarantee belonging. By the 5th page, my eyes blurred, not from sadness but from clarity. I had spent thousands helping them, and yet the only thing I'd truly spent beyond recovery was myself. I thought about the phrase I'd used 100 times, "It's fine, I'll handle it." How many boundaries had I erased with those words? How many pieces of myself had I traded for temporary gratitude? I took a deep breath, picked up the phone, and called the bank. "Hello," I said, my voice steady. "This is Nora. I'd like to review my accounts." The woman on the other end asked for verification details, then waited as I explained what I needed: every automatic payment, every shared authorization, every linked card between me and my son's household. "Would you like to disable them?" she asked. I hesitated for half a heartbeat, then said, "Yes, all of them." When the call ended, I stared at my reflection in the darkened screen of my phone. My hands were trembling slightly, but not from fear, from release. It was as if I had been holding my breath for 10 years and finally remembered how to exhale. I poured another cup of tea, and this time, it didn't taste bitter. It tasted like something new, like boundaries, like freedom. Later that afternoon, I called the hospital to confirm my recovery appointments. The nurse on the line asked if anyone would be helping me at home. I smiled. "No," I said, "but I'll be okay." And I meant it. The woman on the other end laughed softly. "You sound strong." I paused, realizing no one had said that to me in years. "Maybe I'm just starting to be," I replied. When I hung up, I opened my old journal, the same one filled with grocery lists, appointment reminders, and notes for everyone else's lives. On a blank page, I wrote a new title, "Things I've Postponed." Beneath it, I listed them in slow, careful strokes: repaint the living room, rejoin the library club, visit the ocean, buy a pair of shoes just because I like them. With every line, I felt my chest lighten. Outside, the wind rattled the window, carrying the faint hum of distant laughter from a neighbor's yard. It used to sting, hearing joy that wasn't mine. But now it sounded like an invitation. I wasn't sure where to start or how far I'd go, but I knew this much: I was done measuring my worth by how much I was needed. That evening, as I folded the last of my hospital papers, I caught my reflection in the glass again. Same wrinkles, same white hair, but the woman looking back wasn't invisible anymore. She was becoming visible, not to others, but to herself. And that realization, quiet and defiant, was the first real step toward freedom. The first time I walked without help after the surgery, I didn't head toward their house. I went to the bank. The air outside felt different that morning. Brisk, awake, honest. I'd spent so many years driving those same streets to drop off kids, deliver groceries, cover emergencies that weren't mine. But this drive was for me. No lunchboxes in the back seat, no instructions on the dashboard. Just me and a decision that had been waiting for a decade. Inside, the young teller greeted me with the kind of polite smile you give someone who looks like they belong to another time. I smiled back, steady and calm. "I'd like to update my accounts," I said. When I sat across from the banker, he pulled up my information on his screen. So many lines, so many small invisible threads tying my name to their lives. Shared credit lines, automatic transfers, joint authorizations. I hadn't realized how deep the connections went until I saw them written in black and white. "Would you like to remove these names?" he asked, his tone cautious, as if he was afraid the question itself might hurt. "Yes," I said. "All of them." We went through each account, one by one. Every signature felt like reclaiming a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. When he slid the last form across the table, he looked up and said softly, "You're brave, you know that?" I almost laughed. Brave. The word sounded foreign. But maybe it fit. Because sometimes courage isn't loud. Sometimes it's the quiet click of a pen when you finally sign your name for yourself. From the bank, I drove to the lawyer's office. The same man who had helped me write my will years ago looked up from his desk in surprise. "Nora," he said kindly, "what brings you in?" I smiled, firm but gentle. "A small update," I said. "It's time to rearrange who I'm living for." We spent hours reviewing documents. I removed Trevor as my sole heir and replaced him with my granddaughter, Grace, the only one who still called me just to ask how I was doing. The lawyer didn't question my reasons. Maybe he could see it in my eyes. This wasn't revenge. It was clarity. When I left his office, the sun was setting in warm streaks of gold. I stood on the steps for a moment, breathing in the late autumn air, and realized I wasn't shaking. Not from anger, not from guilt, just from the strange sensation of standing fully in my own life again. That evening, Trevor called. I let it ring. Then he texted, "Mom, did you really cancel the accounts? Brooke's upset. We need to talk." I stared at the message for a long moment before typing back, "Yes, I'm taking care of myself now." No explanations, no apologies, just truth. 10 minutes later, the phone rang again. This time I answered. His voice was tight. "Mom, this isn't like you." I looked around my quiet kitchen, the same one I'd cleaned after countless family dinners. "You're right," I said. "It's not. It's better." He was silent. Maybe he didn't recognize the woman on the other end of the line. "You've always wanted to help," he said finally. "We counted on you." "I know," I replied. "That's why it went wrong. You counted, but you never asked if I wanted to." There was a long pause. Then softer, he said, "Are you angry with us?" "No," I said. "I'm just done being invisible." When the call ended, I didn't cry. I felt something deeper, a calm that came from knowing I'd finally stopped waiting for someone else to see my worth. That night, I wrote a new list in my journal titled, "Things I No Longer Owe." I listed them slowly. Constant availability, financial rescue, silence to keep the peace, my health for their convenience. And at the bottom, I wrote, "Their approval." As I closed the notebook, I realized I wasn't just rewriting a will or closing accounts. I was editing the story of my own life, crossing out chapters where I was background and starting one where I was the author. For the first time in years, I didn't dream about responsibilities or family chaos. I dreamed of a shoreline, of walking freely along it, no list in my hand, no one calling my name. And when I woke, I knew exactly what my next step would be. This time, it wouldn't lead back to them. It would lead somewhere new. The next morning, I didn't rush anywhere. No alarms, no calls, no voices tugging me out of bed. Just the soft whisper of wind through the curtains and the faint smell of rain. My legs still ached from the surgery, but the pain felt different now. Less like a burden, more like proof that healing had begun. I made coffee instead of tea this time, just because I could. And when I sat by the window, watching the world unfold in slow motion, I realized something strange. Peace isn't loud. It arrives like breath, quiet, unnoticed, until it fills you completely. That day, I packed a small bag. No lists, no check-ins, no explanations. Just my favorite sweater, a few books, and a promise I made to myself, to live without permission. I drove toward the coast, a place I hadn't seen since my husband was alive. The road curled through golden fields, the kind of beauty you miss when you're always hurrying somewhere else. The longer I drove, the lighter I felt. With every mile, I left behind the version of me who waited for thank yous that never came. When I reached the seaside town, the air smelled like salt and cedar. I found a small cottage with peeling paint and a porch facing the water. It wasn't fancy, just honest. The kind of place that didn't care who you were before you arrived. Inside, I set my things down and opened the windows. The breeze carried the sound of waves and something I hadn't felt in years. Freedom. That evening, I walked to the shore. The sand was cold beneath my bare feet, the tide low and whispering secrets only the sea could keep. I didn't cry. I didn't talk. I just stood there, letting the wind pull at my hair, the salt sting my skin, and for once, I didn't feel like someone's grandmother, mother, or caretaker. I felt like Nora, a woman with her own pulse, her own story, her own right to exist. As I stood there, I thought of a woman I'd met briefly at the hospital before my surgery. Letitia, or Letty, she'd said. She had told me, "Don't let the surgery be the story. Let it be the preface. The good part comes next." At the time, I'd smiled politely. But now, standing under the vast, indifferent sky, I understood what she meant. Healing isn't about going back to who you were. It's about meeting the person who was waiting beneath all the noise. Over the next few days, I learned the rhythm of solitude. Mornings began with the sound of gulls. Afternoons drifted between reading and walking the coastline. Sometimes I'd find myself laughing softly at small things, the shape of a cloud, the stubborn way my hair refused to stay pinned, the taste of coffee gone cold because I forgot it beside a good book. Each laugh felt like a small resurrection. One afternoon, I wandered into an antique shop tucked between a cafe and a bookstore. Inside, the air smelled like old paper and polished wood. "Careful with that shelf," a man's voice said. "It's older than both of us combined." I turned to see him, a tall man with silver hair and kind eyes behind old glasses. His name was Jack. And when he smiled, I felt something gentle stir inside me, a reminder that life wasn't done giving me small wonders. We talked for hours. Not about loss or family or regret, just about books, music, and how the sea never really stops moving, even when it looks still. He told me he restored broken things, lamps, clocks, furniture. People throw away what just needs care, he said. I looked at him and realized he wasn't just talking about objects. Before I left, he said, "If you're ever back in town, come by. I could use some help organizing the books." I smiled, feeling warmth where guilt used to live. "Maybe I will," I said. And I meant it. That night, back at the cottage, I wrote in my notebook. October 16th, walked barefoot on the beach. Spoke to a stranger who saw me before I introduced myself. Didn't feel invisible. Didn't feel small. Just alive. The next morning, the sea was restless, the sky a gray I'd once called lonely but now called honest. I sat on the porch with my coffee, listening, and somewhere between the sound of waves and wind, I whispered, "I'm still here." It wasn't a declaration. It was a discovery. When I came home from the coast, the air felt different, lighter, somehow cleaner. My house, the same one that had once felt like a waiting room between favors, finally felt like mine. The porch creaked under my steps like an old friend sighing in relief. Inside, everything was still but not empty. The silence wasn't cold anymore. It was warm, like a blanket I had finally earned. I unpacked my small bag, books half-read, sand still clinging to my shoes, and the seashell I'd found near the cottage. I placed it on the kitchen windowsill where the morning light could catch it. It wasn't just decoration. It was proof. Proof that I'd gone somewhere for myself, that I'd chosen something not out of duty, but out of desire. Days passed quietly after that. No angry calls. No guilt-laced messages. Just peace, soft and steady. I filled my days with simple things, reading, baking, watering the small plants on my windowsill. For the first time in years, I did things without wondering who else needed me first. I even laughed out loud one afternoon, all alone in the kitchen, because the bread I baked came out lopsided and ugly but tasted perfect. Then, one Saturday, a knock on the door. Soft. Hesitant. When I opened it, there stood my granddaughter, Leia, her hair a little messy, her backpack hanging loosely over one shoulder. Behind her were Max and Ethan, quiet, unsure. "Hi, Grandma," she said. They looked older than I remembered, taller, voices deeper, but their eyes were the same. I stepped aside, and they entered without a word. No one mentioned Brooke. No one mentioned Trevor. The silence between us wasn't angry. It was shy, like a bridge being built slowly. "Dad's been weird," Leia said after a while, twisting her bracelet. "Mom says you don't want to see us anymore." I smiled gently. "That's not true," I said. "I just needed time to remember who I was when I wasn't being everyone's helper." Max frowned. "Did we make you tired?" That question hit harder than I expected. I walked around the counter, knelt down, and held his hand. "No, sweetheart, you never made me tired. Loving without limits did." They were quiet after that. Then, Leia noticed the seashell on the windowsill. "Did you go to the ocean?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "I went to listen to something I'd forgotten, the sound of my own life." She smiled, soft and knowing. "Can we go next time?" I hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, but next time you'll drive." For the next few hours, we played an old board game I found in the closet. The same one we used to play when they were small. No rules, no phones, no guilt. Just laughter. Pure, real laughter that filled the house like sunlight after a storm. When they left that evening, they hugged me tighter than before. "Can we come again?" Ethan asked. "Anytime," I said. "But not because you have to, because you want to." After they walked down the path, I stood at the door, watching their silhouettes fade into the orange evening light. I didn't cry this time. I didn't feel broken or abandoned. I felt something else. Whole. Because I finally understood that love doesn't have to mean losing yourself. That night, I opened my journal one last time. On the final page, I wrote, October 28th, turned 74. No parties, no noise, no pretending. Just peace. Just truth. This life belongs to me now. Then below it, I added a note not just for me, but for anyone who'd ever felt unseen. If they only come when you give, they're not coming for you. If love demands silence, it isn't love, it's use. And if choosing yourself makes them call you selfish, call it what it really is, survival. I closed the journal, blew out the candle, and sat in the quiet. It wasn't the silence of absence anymore, it was the sound of belonging. And before the night fully settled, I whispered to the stillness, to anyone who's ever felt invisible, start again. You are never too old to choose yourself.